hello, welcome to the second day of Future Build. I'm glad that you're all here, come to watch us talk about energy storage for the next hour and 15 minutes, or hour and a half actually, I think. So we've got lots of different things to talk to you about. Hopefully should give you a good broad overview of what storage is and what it can do for the built environment. So we've got a number of different presentations coming up. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about understanding energy storage, so just a really general overview. And then we've got Tim Rose, who's working for Pivot Power, to talk to you about a large-scale energy storage project that he's working on in Oxford. And then we'll have Steve Day from Social Energy, who's talking more about the domestic side of storage and behind-the-meter storage and aggregating that up to provide grid services. So that should be an interesting model to look at. And then we have Barney Evans from WSP, who's going to be talking about the business case for storage. So that should hopefully give us a good round view of storage, the different types, and the financing. And then we can have some time for questions at the end. So I'll get started with my presentation, if that's all right. So like I say, I'm going to give you a bit of a broad overview of energy storage. I'm Madeline Greenhalgh. I'm the policy lead for Regen, which is a not-for-profit based in the southwest with a mission to decarbonise the energy system. So we have a broad overview of what we think is best for decarbonisation in terms of renewable generation, heat, transport, a large number of areas. But we also run the electricity storage network. So we have that focus on storage. So the storage network has been around since about 2008, really pushing to get storage onto the system, and hopefully successfully now, as I'll tell you in a little bit. But this is formed it's a network for the UK of storage storage members across the UK. So we have a broad range of members, not just batteries. We're talking, pumped hydro, liquid air energy storage, from small scale to large scale. So we have a really good overview of how storage is functioning right now in the UK and what needs to happen to make that a bit better. So I'll go through some of that in my presentation. So I won't go through all of these, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of the different technologies that comprise the term electricity storage, because often we just think batteries, and I don't blame you, because that's most of the technology we're talking about at the moment. But there's a huge number of different technologies that can perform the role of electricity storage. And the first one there, pumped hydro, is actually what we have most of the capacity for in the UK at the moment, and probably around the world. So we have a really large, excellent set of pumped hydro facilities. You may have seen some of them in Wales or up in Scotland. Really fun to go visit if you ever go see them. So that's providing quite a lot of our capacity at the moment. But there's lots and lots of new, exciting technologies that are coming through that can provide electricity storage, but in very different ways. So that might be really long duration storage, or it might be very fast responding storage. But it's a huge variety, which is really, really great, because it means that we can provide all those different services we need to the grid. So a couple, I won't go through most of them on there, but some really interesting ones that are coming out, things like liquid air energy storage, which uses old gas equipment, which is really great, so we can repurpose some of these stranded assets that we're going to get in the coming few years or decades. Things like hydrogen for much longer term storage, and of course batteries. So this is what we're mostly talking about when we're talking about storage. And really at the moment, whilst there are lots of different chemical compositions, we're mostly talking about lithium ion, because that's where the costs are lowest. And for the built environment, this is really the technology that's going to be making a difference in the next few years. Most of these other technologies, they do have a role, but a lot of them are quite large scale, and there's more challenges to integrating that into the built environment. But storage, as in terms of batteries, is much more suitable from a wide variety of scales that really plays a big role in the built environment. So how much storage do we actually have at the moment in the UK? Well, we've got a lot more than we used to, which is really good news. From about, let's say, 5 years ago, we've increased from a few megawatts of storage through to about 1 gigawatt now we think we've got. And this is front-of-the-meter storage. This is stuff that's connected to the grid, either at the distribution network or at the transmission network. But we think about a gigawatt, which is a huge rise in the last sort of 5 or so years. And it's really, really impressive and is continuing to rise. But I should point out that of the 4 gigawatts that we have in the UK, 3 gigawatts of that is pumped hydro. So actually, when you look at that in comparison, that 1 gigawatt is still needs to catch up a bit to pumped hydro. So we've got some way to go, but the increase is certainly on it's increasing basically. So that's very good news, I think, I hope. And I should also point out that this is just front-of-the-meter storage, like I say, stuff that's connected to the grid. We don't really have a good picture, or I don't at least, of what storage is behind the meter. So this might be a battery that's behind the meter of a business, for example, a factory, or the Tesla Powerwall that's hopefully sat on your wall at home. So we don't really have a good picture. That might be a much bigger figure, and increase that figure for the amount of storage we have in the UK. But it's very difficult to get a picture of that, and I'll come to some of that, and the challenges that poses in a little bit. So why are we getting such an increase in storage? Well, there's lots of different reasons behind that, a lot of policy reasons and push from the UK government, but one of the main things is that reduction in cost of lithium ion, which is, as you can see, I've stolen this from Bloomberg, and from 2010, when the cost was $1,160 per kilowatt hour, in 2018, in 8 years, that's gone down to $176 per kilowatt hour. So we're seeing the cost of lithium-ion batteries come down significantly. So that's enabling us to create all different scales of electricity storage, and really helping people to make that technology investable. This is the sort of curve that we saw for solar technologies as well. So the cost of solar decreased hugely in probably a similar time frame, actually. And look how much solar we've seen come onto the system in those years. So it's a success story that hopefully can be repeated for electricity storage as well. But what can storage actually do for the system? We talk about storage, we say it's so important for the grid, for decarbonisation, but why is that? What does it actually do? And I think sometimes it probably has more things that it can provide than you might think. It doesn't just store energy and then pass it on again. There's lots of different things it can do for the grid. So I should have mentioned this at the start, really, but we're in a climate emergency, and the grid and the energy system is changing to adapt for that. So we're decarbonising our electricity system at quite a rapid rate, which is really good. But that comes with its own challenges. So, for example, we are producing energy at different times now. So electricity is coming from solar and wind at different times. It's not a constant source of energy for the grid. And that provides some challenges to grid frequency, for example. I won't go into some of the technical details of why that is, but essentially it means that the frequency on the system is a bit more difficult to predict and can drop at certain points. Storage, particularly battery storage, can respond to that drop in seconds, or less than a second, in fact, in milliseconds, to bring that frequency back up to what it's supposed to be. So you'll remember we had a blackout last summer in August. Now, there's lots of different reasons why that went on for quite a long time, but one of the reasons that happened is because we had a really quick drop in frequency. And one of the reasons it wasn't quite as bad as it could have been is because we had a lot of storage that was able to respond in a millisecond to bring that frequency back up to where we needed it to be. So storage can quickly respond to that. And that's where at the moment it's providing a lot of value to the grid. Of course, reserve is the key thing for storage. That's what it does. It stores energy and discharges it when we need it. So we can, if we have solar during the day, we can store that energy until the evening when we actually need it. And that ability to shift in price and time is really important for our energy system. So we can shift energy from times of low demand to high demand. So if it's windy at night, we don't need that energy. We can store it and use it in the morning when people wake up. And we can shift in price periods, and this is really where the business case for storage lies. We can buy energy and import energy when it's cheap, and sell it when it's expensive. So that's one of the major models for business case, doing that arbitrage. And of course, the last one here, decarbonisation. So electricity storage, all of these things it does here, it's supporting renewables. This is what we need at the moment. We are, as wonderfully pointed out by this conference, which I'm really impressed by the messaging that we're getting here. This is an emergency, and it's quite easy to get involved in the technical details of storage, what it does, how it responds really quickly to frequency on the grid. But actually what it's doing is helping us decarbonize our energy system, and that's so important right now, as we really need to rush to get reduce our emissions as much as possible to meet the climate emergency. So storage is a key technology that enables that. So I won't dwell on this slide too much, because I think you've probably had this many times to every energy presentation you go to. But I think this gives you a bit of an idea of why the built environment and why smaller scale storage is going to be much more relevant in the future. Because we're moving from a much more centralized system with really large thermal power plants across the country and very specific areas around the country, to a much more decentralized system. So renewables and storage are connecting at a wide variety of locations across the country. They're connecting to the distribution grid rather than the transmission network. So that means that it's being managed much more locally, taking advantage of various different geographies in order to provide the renewable energy that we need. But that means that we're seeing that at a much smaller scale. So we're not just seeing these huge gigawatt-size power plants, big gas plants, big coal plants. We are seeing that in terms of the offshore wind, but we are much more seeing people turning to smaller scale energy generation and storage. So at the very smallest example, that's people putting solar panels on their roofs and people putting batteries in their houses. So there's much more of a move to that in the energy system, and that means there's more of a market for it. So if you have solar panels on your house, you can get a battery, and you can be either generating your own energy or putting that back onto the grid. So this is my area of expertise. I'm the policy lead, so I'm constantly hammering on government's door, telling them to do better, telling Ofgem that they need to improve their policies so that we can have more storage on the system, we can have more renewables. So I wanted to just go through some of the challenges and the opportunities. What are the challenges for storage? What are the opportunities we're seeing? I'll start with challenges, because I'll end on a high note with opportunities. It doesn't often happen with me. I tend to be a bit negative, but I'll try and keep with the positive. So the main challenge for storage, why we're not seeing as much of it as we want to, well, there's no financial support. There's never been any financial support for storage. So the feed-in tariff that we had for small-scale generation, the contracts for difference, which, we've seen come back for solar in the last couple of days, and for onshore wind, none of that exists for storage. We've always been working on a merchant model of how the support we're getting is solely based on what we can get from the wholesale market and the imbalance market. So that provides some challenges, particularly at the small scale level. Batteries are expensive to put in your house. They're expensive to put behind the meter if you've got a factory. So what sort of revenue streams are we pulling in to counter that lack of financial support from subsidy schemes? Well, one of those bits of the business case is network charging. So network charging is what Ofgem or what all your distribution networks and the national grid will charge everybody in the country to support the building of all the pipes and wires that take electricity around the country. So it's a fixed charge that everyone has on their bill. And it's going for a huge reform at the moment. It's fascinating if you like energy policy, very boring for everyone else. But this is going through a huge change. And previously, as you might expect, if you can reduce your demand on the grid, those network charges come down, because it means it costs less for National Grid to balance that energy. Now that's being scrapped. So this was a huge business case for storage. If you can use storage to reduce your demand, if you've got a big factory or something like that, then you benefit from that reduction in network charges. But that's gone. So there's a bit of there's quite a lot of money there that's gone missing, shall we say. And then this point of behind the meter, if you can't see it, you can't control it. Well, this is the attitude that I think we're getting from BEIS, from our Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, from Ofgem and from National Grid, and it's understandable. If it's behind the meter, it means it's not connected to the grid. It means that they can't see how much there is. As I mentioned earlier, we don't really have a figure of how much behind the meter storage there is. If you can't see it, you can't control it. You can't understand what it's doing and can't see what impact that's having on the grid. And that is a challenge. But it means that we're not getting as many policies, favourable policies, as we might like for behind-the-meter storage, which has a huge role to play, particularly for the built environment. Lots of storage is going to be behind the meter. So we need to make sure that it's going to happen. We need to make sure we can see it, and that if we need to, we can control it. So that's the negatives out of the way. What about the positives? What are we seeing coming through? Well, the Smart Export Guarantee, which you may have heard of, possibly. So this is essentially the replacement for the feed-in tariff, which was a subsidy from government for the energy you were exporting to the grid from your solar panels. But this is essentially to say, well, if you're not getting that support from the government, who's paying for your energy you're exporting to the grid? Well, it's your supplier. So the Smart Export Guarantee, it guarantees that suppliers mandates them to give you a price for the energy you're exporting to the grid. That seems fairly logical, but it's quite difficult to do. So they've mandated that if you have solar or wind or something installed on your property, your supplier will pay for that. Now that includes storage as well at the moment. So there's a bit of an opportunity there for if you want to export some of your energy from your storage unit to the grid, you will get a price for that. And we're seeing some competition come through from suppliers now, which is quite exciting. So especially for batteries, if you can get a tariff that's not just one fixed price, that actually rewards you for being able to export to the grid at times when that price is fairly expensive, then you could get some returns from that. And that's really interesting. That's not something we've seen happen before. So going back to this point about network charges, well, we should really be rewarding people who can install storage and reduce their demand on the grid. That's a good thing for the grid. That's what everybody wants to happen. If you can reduce demand when it's necessary, the grid will be very happy with you and should be giving you money for that, should be rewarding you. There's an opportunity for that to happen through this massive reform of network charges that I mentioned. So we just want to make sure that if people are installing behind-the-meter storage, they're getting that reduction in network charges for what the benefit they're providing to the grid. And then aggregation. So I won't dwell too much on this because Steve from Social Energy is going to cover a bit of this, I think. But this is, if we go back to this side here, where I was saying we have a more decentralized system, and we've got lots of little bits of storage across the country, maybe in people's houses or behind the meter. If you can aggregate that up, then you can sell that energy to the grid. Instead of having a 10 kilowatt battery, you could sell it as a few megawatts, 5, 10, maybe more. And you can aggregate that up, so someone will manage that for you and sell that to the grid, and you'll see some of the returns from that. So this idea of if it's behind the meter, you can't see it, you can't control it. If someone is aggregating all of that energy and then showing the grid what it is, and the grid is able to control it, that gets you around this problem of behind-the-meter storage. And it's also a really good way of helping part of the business case. If you've got a small-scale battery, if you can pay someone to aggregate that up for you and get some return from that, that's a good business opportunity, a good way for investment. And I think that's it from me. I could talk about loads more stuff, but I think I'll leave it there. We'll have some questions at the end, so you can ask me anything you need to on that. But I'll move on now to Tim from Pivot Power. So we changed things around, ordered around a little bit. So Tim Rose from Pivot Power is going to come talk about the Energy Super Hub in Oxford.
Thanks, Madeline. Yeah, I'm going to stray a little bit from pure storage over the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, because the project that I'm going to tell you about does include storage. It's large-scale storage. We're talking about the scales that Madeline was just taking us through, but also we're looking at electric vehicle networks, and we're also looking at ground source heat pumps, and that's all part of an integrated project. So that's what I'm going to talk through over the next few minutes or so. But just to put some of that into perspective and explain why this is important to Oxford, this really goes back to a point, again, Madeline made at the beginning. We're in a climate emergency, and quite a number of councils now have declared a climate emergency, a very large number actually, but I think Oxford were one of the first, if not the first. They declared an emergency at the beginning of last year, and have since been the first council to implement a citizens' assembly on this subject as well. So they're very forward-looking, very ambitious in their plans and what they want to do. And as an example, out of that citizens' assembly came a recommendation to look at a zero-emission zone in the centre of the city, which they are going to implement in the course of probably the end of this year, actually. So in phases, but that's a very good example of the real steps that they're taking. Obviously, we've also got quite a lot of interest in the kids' climate strikes and all those other things as well. So there's a lot going on in Oxford, and this project forms quite a core part of their strategy for supporting the decarbonisation, electrification of the city. So that's just a little bit of sort of scene setting. But let me tell you about the project itself. So, Energy Superhub Oxford, or ESO, as it's known, is one of 4 demonstrator programs that it's part funded by the Industrial Strategy, by UK Research and Innovation. It's about a £40 million project, and as I said, there are 4 of these on this scale that are actually putting various elements of electrification into action to see if we can demonstrate some models for how we'd install and roll out smart local energy systems around the country. So that's what this is trying to do. Oxford's lucky enough to actually have 2 of these projects in its area, one in the city and one in Oxfordshire Council. They're all looking, one thing they have in common is they're looking at heat, at transport, and at power. So trying to integrate all those 3 things and see how we can use that to accelerate the road to decarbonisation. So what the Superhub project is doing is that we're showcasing rapid electric vehicle charging through high power networks, hybrid energy battery energy storage systems, and I'll tell you what that means in a minute, low carbon heating, and smart energy management. All of that, as I say, a big part of supporting Oxford City's drive towards zero carbon, which incidentally they're hoping to achieve in the sort of early 2030s. So they are quite ambitious on this. So as with all of these demonstrator projects, it's a consortium-based approach. For us, we have 6 partners in this project, and clearly Oxford City Council is a really core partner. So really, without them, this wouldn't happen. We have all sorts of hurdles to overcome, planning and otherwise, and they're a huge part of that. But there are a number of other partners as well. So the second one on the list is Pivot Power. I work for Pivot Power, and we're the lead partner in this particular consortium. And we're engaged in 2 things really: facilitating EV uptake by putting in high-powered private wire networks, and also, coming back to the subject, large-scale battery storage. I'll talk a little bit about the roles of some of the others in a second as well. So this is the sort of the simplest way of explaining what ESO is about. We're delivering innovation in all of these areas, all of these 3 sectors of the industry, or vectors as they call them in UK Research and Innovation. So firstly, on the energy side, we're installing the world's first hybrid transmission connected battery. So Madeline talked a bit about the difference between the transmission network and the distribution network, and most of the renewables that we've seen going in to date, and most of the storage has gone in on the distribution network, which sits between the transmission network and us and our homes and residences. So this will be a hybrid battery. It's a combination of lithium-ion and one of the other technologies that Madeline mentioned, which is a flow technology, which I'll touch on a little bit in a minute. And that's large-scale stuff, and it sits in front of the meter. It's right on the national grid. So that's the unique thing about this. It's connected to the transmission network. Then secondly, on the transport side, we're really trying to promote EV charging at scale here. So from the main connection point in Oxford, the main transmission substation, we'll be putting in a private wire network that connects up a couple of important hubs in the city. So one of those is a public charging hub, and that's going to be situated at one of the park and rides on the west side of the city. And then we're going to be putting in, there's going to be enough power there for up to 100 rapid charging points. So again, we'll touch on that in a minute. But also, we want to roll this out to the council fleet. And importantly, this goes beyond that into buses. And we're at the moment very engaged in trying to bring buses on board here, because that will be a very important step to really helping decarbonize the city. But also commercial fleets, taxis, etc. So there's a lot of scope with the level of power that's going in to be able to connect people into the transport network. And then thirdly, on the heat side, so as part of this project, we're installing 300 ground source heat pumps in the city, and they'll be smart. They'll have smart controls, which will all be about trying to improve comfort in homes, reducing fuel poverty, and also improving people's heating bills. But all that stuff is brought together by this red bar in the middle, which is we're calling an optimization and trading engine. But what it really is, it's a machine learning based tool that really works out the demand that we have for certainly power of the EV charging hubs, but also it's quite sophisticated in its algorithms around trading on the energy markets. Another thing that Madeline mentioned a minute ago. So and also the smart controls that we're talking about on the heat pump. So again, without this, the whole thing wouldn't hang together. Just to pause on this point as well, I think storage is the sort of core of this discussion, and I think without storage, this project wouldn't be possible, because at the moment, although we may be saying in some areas commercial viability of storage at certain scales is still questioned, at this level it certainly is working, and as far as this project is concerned, it's an important part of delivering revenues that support the rest of the project. So in this case, storage is working. Now I should say that project, as I say, it's a demonstrated program for the industrial strategy. It's part grant funded as well. So we do have grant funding to support all this innovation. So just who's doing what? I won't go into great detail, but as I mentioned, Pivot Power here, we're really interested in the grid scale storage and in the EV charging at scale, and that's our raison d'etre, and we're hoping to roll out many more of these projects, Oxford being the first one. Oxford City Council are leading on the EV charging piece. They obviously own a lot of the infrastructure, the fleet, obviously their own fleet, but the park and rides as well. So they're key in letting the contracts that are going to enable us to get the chargers in place, etc. Redtea are an energy storage company who specialize in flow batteries, vanadium flow batteries. I'll touch on that in a second, not in too much detail, but I think it's quite interesting. Kensa are a heat pump installer. They're doing that all over the country, and Oxford is another place where, obviously supports this project very well, but there's a lot of opportunity around Oxfordshire more widely as well as lots of other parts of the country. And then Habitat Energy is an Oxford-based tech company who are building that brain, the machine learning AI piece of the jigsaw. And then we have Oxford University, who are playing the key role in evaluating all this. So I'll talk about timescales in a minute, but these guys will be helping us demonstrate that we're meeting the benefits that we want to achieve. So I've just got a quick slide on each. I won't go into huge detail, but this project is all about innovation, and so there's innovation in all of those three areas. So as I mentioned, this is the first transmission-connected hybrid battery in the world, we think, and certainly the first UK transmission-connected large-scale battery. It's a very big battery, 50 megawatts. It's difficult to get your mind around what that means sometimes, but I'll talk a little bit about how megawatts transfer into supermarkets and stuff in a second when we get onto the transport side. So it consists of a 50 megawatt lithium-ion battery. So to put that into some sort of scale context, that's about 19 shipping containers of lithium-ion. So it's taking up a lot of space. That's the lithium-ion piece itself with all the electronics that support it. And this is the flow battery, which is a 2 megawatt flow battery. So you can see that's has a much larger capacity, but in terms of footprint, the flow batteries at the moment take up quite a lot of space, but they do have some real benefits. So some of the interesting things we're doing with this is providing sort of boost facilities and the like, things that haven't been done before on the flow side. So that's where the innovation's going in, and from Innovate UK's point of view, this is the sort of core of the innovation of the storage piece. Madeline mentioned some of the grid services, and that's a really important part for us. So this battery will be able to provide those services to National Grid, help them stabilize frequencies and the balancing of the grid. So we can trade in several ways on this battery, and we're building that piece of specialist software that I mentioned earlier, which is going to help us do that in 3 different areas. So day ahead, in the day, between the half-hour segments, and then really live balancing mechanism time. So we're working on several different markets, and that takes an awful lot of capturing of data in terms of weather, in terms of demand, and trying to predict when the price is going to be high and when it's going to be low, and taking the arbitrage on that. So that's what this is really all about. So that's our storage piece. The lithium-ion battery, by the way, we just, some of you may have seen, we just placed our order for that battery last week. So it's 100 megawatts for the first 2 projects that we're doing, of which this is one, with a Finnish company called Wärtsilä. So that's now underway, and we'll be connecting this at the end of the year. I'll talk about timescales in a second. I won't go into detail on this, but I did want to just touch on flow, because I think it's interesting. I've got a bit of a chemistry background, so I think this is quite an interesting and a different approach to lithium-ion. What this does is it uses a vanadium-based solution. Vanadium is quite interesting in that it's the only metal that has 4 different charge states, and that allows you to play quite interesting games with this fluid, passing it across a membrane and a charge passing to and fro from the other side without any degradation. And that's the interesting thing about flow batteries. So unlike lithium-ion, like our phones and computers and everything, which degrade over time, this never degrades. So it has real benefits in that sense, and that means that by optimizing when you use this battery compared to the lithium battery, you can lengthen the life of the whole storage system. So having a combination of this is really about trying to optimize and improve the returns on an overall battery storage system. So as I said, there's some quite innovative things going on here as well, but this is all going to be going in the course of this year. So just on transport briefly, we think this is the world's first transmission-connected EV network. Again, that's direct into the high-power grid, the national grid, as opposed to the distribution network. So that public super hub, I mentioned these 2 hubs. This is called the Oxford Smile, by the way. This is quite sweet, isn't it? But we're linking up a park and ride on the west of the city, which is the public sector, public side of the super hub, and this is the fleet hub, which is where the council is charging its vehicles on the east side of the city. And as I mentioned before, that super hub will be pretty high power, up to 25 megawatts. That's probably about the equivalent of 100 supermarkets running at the same time. So these rapid chargers on the EV side they have a very high demand, and this is the challenge that we have in electrifying the country. It's all very well to buy our electric vehicles, but without a charging infrastructure that's going to support that, and that needs multiples of what we use today to be able to deliver that power, and that needs a lot of upgrade for the distribution network. So hopefully what we're doing here by building a private network is taking a bit of that pressure off the distribution grid. So we're upgrading some 10% of the council's vehicles to electrifying those and shifting demand overnight. That's one of the models that Madeline mentioned again. So by providing that power at times we can take the power in at low cost, and then we can charge vehicles overnight when in order to reduce the economics on the overall fleet. We're also running some sort of taxi try before you buy scheme in Oxford, trying to get the 100-odd Hackney cab drivers in Oxford to go electric as well. So that's all part of the project. And then finally on the heat side, so 300 ground source heat pumps, and mainly residential, but also some commercial and some public sector buildings, etc. But these are all based on a shared array. These are vertically drilled heat arrays, and that's a good way of, and they're expensive, and they're quite expensive in Oxford because of the geology there particularly, but it's a good way to share, to amortize the costs amongst different residences. So those will go in together with a newly developed shoebox-sized ground source heat pump. So each property has its own heat pump, and it has its own smart controls. And those smart controls learn about the preferences of the resident. When she wants temperature X, Y during different times of the day, and based on the fabric of the building, it also learns the speed at which the building heats up and cools down. So it works out a profile to optimize the heating. And that works together with a time of use tariff. So we'll be seeing more time of use electricity tariffs that really are giving us prices per half hour, for example. And when you combine those things, you can decide to heat your property at cheaper times and reduce in that way the cost to the owner. So quite interesting stuff again, and that's all machine learning based technology that's going to be supporting that. So just a couple of other slides, a few other quick slides just to show how we're going to develop this over time. But firstly on timescales, so this project is all going in this year. So we spent the first year, it's a 3-year project. All of the demonstrator projects I talked about are. We spent the last year planning and getting planning permissions for the battery, etc. And this year is all about building this system. So by the end of 2020, this will be connected, and we will be able to charge vehicles at those super hubs, both the public and the council's vehicles. And then we have a year of operation and evaluation, and we'll be feeding back into Innovate UK and BEIS and hopefully trying to demonstrate that there's some elements in this that could really give us some pointers to how smart local energy systems could work and help us rapidly decarbonize. So just very quickly, this is what I showed you, the picture of the Smile that we're starting with, but this is going to expand hopefully quite rapidly. We talked about buses, last mile logistics depots, mail companies, for example. So there's quite a lot of opportunity there, particularly on buses. If we can win the recently announced Bus Town project, which the government has recently announced, that will be a huge decarbonisation win for Oxford. So we're hoping that there's something in that will really help us boost this network. And then there are other things beyond that as well, other park and rides, etc. And we can expand this over time as partners join. So I'll just wrap up. I mean, we've done quite a lot, but and the main message here is there's a lot been done, but there's an awful lot to do this year, and this is the year of building this project. So we're actually putting stuff in the ground, and that will require a lot of engagement with the residents of Oxford, and hopefully we're going to bring everybody along with us in what we think is a pretty exciting project. And of course, there's lots of lessons to be learned in this. and I'm not going to go through all those, but the financing challenges are quite interesting. Both two of those companies that I mentioned, who are members of this consortium, have been taken over, gone into acquisitions or mergers. Us being one of them. So Pivot Power has been acquired by EDF in the course of the last few months, all as a part of trying to build the investment that we need to roll out not just Oxford but another 40 of these projects. Red Tea is also in merger discussions with a Canadian company. So quite a lot of these sort of things come up and they potentially slow the project down. You have to find ways around them. That's quite interesting. And resourcing and all the sort of things you would expect have also been interesting. But as I said, I think at the moment this works on storage as the basis. So the storage system is really supporting the EV network. And the EV network wouldn't stand on its own with the investment that's required. But given a bit of time, it will do. Hopefully, as EV rates expand and we see rollout across the country, then certainly EV networks will stand on their own, so we can decide whether to do storage, whether to do EV, and then obviously the heat pumps as well are also somewhat independent. I mean, we can roll those out either with or without that system. Okay, that's all from me. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to some questions later.
Great, thanks, Tim. I've seen that presentation a few times, I have to say, and it's always just fascinating. I love seeing how storage can actually be integrated with all of those different bits of infrastructure that Tim mentioned. A lot of the time we talk about storage, it's just a battery in a field providing one service, but actually look at how diverse it could be, look at all the things that it could provide. I just think that's a really interesting model, particularly when we're talking about the built environment. I'm going to ask if Steve Day has arrived yet. He's been having some trouble with trains, so I'm guessing not. So we'll just skip through his slides. Hopefully he'll be able to pop in after Barney has finished. But I will introduce Barney from WSP, who's going to talk a bit about the business case for storage. We'll get there eventually. There we go.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Barney Evans. I'm from a company called WSP. We're a big consultancy, and we advise both at the really sort of large strategy end for big corporates, but we also do a lot of technical work in energy storage and the whole sort of zero carbon agenda. So I'm going to try and talk about the business case. I was asked to talk about solar and storage, but I'm pretty much going to ignore solar, so I'm just going to try and talk about the business case for energy storage. And why? I'll use this. Okay, so there's the four things I wanted to tell you today that's really important. The good news is we've almost won the battle for zero carbon. There's only really one challenge left, and that's the when of energy, the balancing the supply and demand, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Talking about the business case for energy storage, you've heard Tim and Madeline actually touch on a few things. There's obviously a financial one, but I'm also going to quickly discuss some of the other business cases, inverted commas, that you might have. Obviously, the business case will depend on the type of storage, and I'll talk about some of those that Madeline and Tim have already addressed. And then I'm going to finish off with my sort of big picture advice to our big clients about energy storage is you need to think quite long term on it. Okay, so just to start off really big picture, the energy system of the future, that graph is my guess of the energy system of 2050. And the news is that the future is going to be, on the supply side, it's going to be almost exclusively wind, nuclear and solar, which is fantastic because they're all zero carbon. Obviously, different opinions on nuclear, but they're all zero carbon, certainly. And they're going to be really cheap, really cheap. They're cheap already, and they're going to get forever cheaper. And so that's great. We need storage to integrate them and help us become zero carbon. So you could export the energy when the sun and wind aren't there, and then import it when there's lots of sun and wind. So crucial for zero carbon, as Madeline said. There is a problem. The fly in the ointment is that most clean energy is intermittent, and even nuclear is troublesome because it's difficult to turn off. And the electrical system needs to be balanced all the time. Like Madeline was discussing some of these balancing services. It needs to be in balance every millisecond, more or less. And as you can see, this model I've built of our future energy system, the blue line, which looks like a heart trace, is an energy supply of this system that I've guessed is going to be in 2050, and mainly wind, some solar and some nuclear. And the orange line is going to be our energy demand. So this is everything's been electrified, all the heat, all the vehicles and so on. And the thing you should notice immediately is that the blue line and the orange line don't match very often. And that's a real problem, because if you've got too much supply, you need to do something with it. And if you haven't got enough supply, then we've got a real problem because the energy system won't work. And we do have some solutions for that, which we'll talk about. But actually, one of the constraints that Madeline didn't mention, which I would mention on this, is at the moment our accounting system does not recognise the benefit of energy storage in decarbonisation. And we're just going to try and quickly illustrate this. This is sort of quite a big corporate point, I suppose. So the graph you can see on the screen is my company, let's say, or your house. It doesn't really matter. And the grey line is your energy demand without energy storage. So you put some energy storage in because you want to help us be zero carbon and you want to help integrate all those renewables, which is great. But what happens is your energy demand goes up because no energy storage is 100% efficient. It doesn't matter whether it's a battery or a flywheel or any form of storage. You always need more energy. And because of the way we do calculations on greenhouse gas emissions, that will always increase your carbon emissions when you do your reporting. And it's a major barrier for us when we're talking to corporates, because when we're talking, or even a homeowner, if you want to be zero carbon, we'll talk to companies that are our clients, and they'll say, how can energy storage help us be zero carbon? And the answer is it can't. It can't at all at the moment. And those policies will change, which is a bit my point on the long term. So being perhaps a bit more prosaic on the energy storage. On the business case, there is you have to decide what you mean by the business case for energy storage, and this is part of the problem with energy storage and why it's not quite as simple as solar and wind. Is it's depends what it's doing. So, for example, a battery can be an uninterruptible power supply. So it could be providing your protection against electrical issues. So it could be, there's a business case there even if you're not making any money. Connection agreements are another one. It's potentially, Tim was mentioning, if you've got a supermarket, your peak demand, as he said, was about 200 kilowatts. You put a few superchargers in your car park to encourage your customers to come, and you've just quadrupled your peak electrical demand, and you can't do that. So perhaps energy storage could help you, and I'm sure Tim could help you provide a battery to help buffer that energy demand. So there could be a business case there. So I mentioned the EV charging. It could be a long-term part of being zero carbon. So you might want to integrate more wind and solar into your system, and therefore you see energy storage as part of a long-term zero carbon plan. It can be a hedge. So energy storage. I'm quite a firm believer that the energy prices are going in one direction and it's down, but there's a lot of volatility on their way down, and so what energy storage could offer you, particularly if you're a really big energy user and energy is a real problem for you, it could offer a hedge. So it can protect you against some of the really spiky energy prices you might see. And then finally, there's the sort of vanilla. I pay £1,000 for a battery. It saves me £200 a year. It's a payback, and that is available. It's just difficult. So zooming into that specific, just perhaps on the payback, I think Madeline and Tim have already covered some of these great opportunities. So there's time of use. I think that's the fundamental benefit of energy storage. There will always be a value to being able to store energy at one time and use it at another. Always, because it's sometimes energy will be more expensive and sometimes it'll be cheaper. The problem I'd say for the business case is I can't tell you what that will be in 3 or 4 years, and that was why solar and wind was so great, because I could tell you exactly what you're going to earn in 15 years on a spreadsheet with a projection, and I can't tell you that on energy storage. It's really exciting though, because this is already happening in domestic homes. I follow a lot of nerdy people online who are boasting about how they're turning their things off and turning their things on in the middle of the night and so on. And then there are the other ones Tim and Madeline suggested. There's triads and duos. So these are commercial charges mainly, and they're charges for using the transmission system and the distribution system. And as Madeline said, unfortunately, the benefits around those have been reduced hugely, and that's been quite a challenge for the energy storage sector. And then there's the ancillary services, which is really big scale. So the aggregators, where they're contracting with National Grid. So there are some great financial returns there. The problem, I would say, I think I'm right in saying, essentially with all 4 of them, is I can't tell you what they'll be in 2022, and that really, really affects the business case. So, just looking at the types of energy storage, I've tried to do a little graph here of the business challenge, case challenge, and the scale. So if I was advising you on energy storage, I'd say I would start off with the energy storage you've already got. So well, most businesses will have hot water storage, for example. And as we electrify heat, or increasingly electrify heat, we'll almost all have hot water tanks in our homes. And a hot water tank is 5-6 kilowatt hours of energy storage right there. You can heat that up at a certain part of the day when it's cheap and so on. So it's quite small scale, but the business case is great because it doesn't cost you anything. You had that energy storage anyway. And it'll be the same with your electric vehicle. So if you're a company that has a fleet of delivery vehicles, or even if you're just a homeowner who has a car on the drive that's electric, using that will be increasingly a great way of using energy storage because it's free. It's marginal. It's really interesting. Madeline was talking about the scale of energy storage at the moment. At the moment, I think we've got about 2 gigawatt hours of energy storage driving around on our roads. If you do the maths with your fag packet and work it out, if we electrify all our vehicles, which we probably will do sort of mid-30s, 2030s, you're talking a terawatt hour of energy storage driving around our roads potentially. And that's phenomenally, what you could do with that is phenomenal. You wouldn't be able to use it all, obviously, but the potential is phenomenal. And then you've got this sort of the shipping container of batteries, which it's a bit more, it depends on the business use and the business case and so on. It's definitely more challenging because you won't have that. It wouldn't be part of your system automatically, but you could invest on it in the right case. And then perhaps further out in big picture, I'm quite a big fan of hydrogen being the peaking power of our future. It's unlikely to affect us on a domestic scale, but certainly on the really large scale, there's some opportunities there. This was my brilliant idea, and Tim has stolen the whole thing, really. What we've been working with our clients on is something we call 360 Energy, and that's essentially this is basically what Tim just said about Oxford, really. It's what we're saying is energy storage can be a great business case as part of a more integrated system. So if you're either taking an existing city or even a new development, so maybe a mixed-use development, you can look at, you're probably talking about electrified heat now. You'll probably have renewables on your roof, and you might have wind turbines. You'll almost certainly have EV charging, and quite a lot of it. And so battery can play quite an important role in balancing those services. And the brain is Tim's, what he was calling machine learning. That's the brain. So it's really interesting if you're involved in that kind of thing. And it's a really great opportunity for energy storage, I think. So I'm going to finish off just briefly. I think one of the things I would say about energy storage is the business case is challenging for most of us. So clients often come away disappointed when I talk to them about energy storage because it's not quite as easy as it should be. But there are fundamentals about energy storage that are good. So the energy supply is increasingly intermittent. This is my point. This may not be the energy system of the future. It's my guess. It may be different. But something like that is going to happen. We are going to have a lot of wind and a lot of solar on our system, and that will lead a lot of balancing. So much greater need for energy storage. I think in the next 2 or 3 years, energy storage policy on decarbonisation, so being zero carbon, will recognise the benefit of energy storage, and that really, I think, that will unlock a lot of investment from a corporate perspective, if not a domestic perspective. And so, some general advice on energy storage: I'd say start with what you've got that's free. Think about what you've got already, and that can merge with things called demand side response, but and slowly go from there. Okay, that's me.
I think unless Steve is here and not telling me, I think he is still on a train. He's planning to get here, so hopefully he will be here for some questions. But I think I'll ask Tim and Barney to come and sit up, and we'll just go straight to some questions for the panel. And hopefully Steve can come in a little bit and tell us a bit more about social energy. So just to fill in that little gap that we're missing with Steve. Steve was going to talk about the domestic side of things, and we've all referred to it a little bit, but I think it's a really interesting thing that how you can install lots and lots of small-scale batteries in people's homes and use that to be of benefit to the grid. Because one of the things at the moment that Barney mentioned is that it's quite difficult to build a business case for storage, particularly at that small scale. We're seeing the revenues and the payback period for example, solar plus storage at a domestic scale are pretty long term. It takes quite a while. You essentially need to have a lot of capital and be able to wait quite some time to see some payback on on the asset you've installed. What social energy are doing is allowing using that battery to provide grid services and gaining revenue in that way, and providing a business model that might help with that business case for domestic scale storage. But this brings me on to my first question for Barney and Tim. All of that requires a third party to do a lot of those calculations for you. We've seen in Barney's presentation that the business case for storage is pretty complex, actually. If you were putting solar on your roof a few years ago, you essentially get your installer and your supplier to sort out in the installation. They get the money from the government through the feed-in tariff, and that's you sorted, really. Same applies to a lot of different larger scale renewable generation projects too. Storage is hugely complicated. It really depends on the scale of the storage you've got. It depends on where it's located, which will then affect the business case for it. So a lot of that, Tim referred to it a bit in that red bar he had in the middle of the machine learning and the platform that's needed to control the batteries. A lot of that's going to be requiring a third party to do that. I mentioned aggregation. We put all those batteries together in the home, for example, and put that onto the grid. Someone's got to do that for you. This requires a much more complex set of issues at play than just installing solar panels. So I guess my question is, how do we see those third parties coming into play when we haven't really in other types of generation that we've seen growing on the system? What role will they play, and how does that affect the business case? If you've got someone taking a cut of that because they're having to do a fairly complex run a platform for you, what difference does that make for storage?
Does that work? It does work. I can talk to that probably a little bit more on the large-scale side again, and then perhaps Barney might have some thoughts on the smaller-scale domestic side. But yeah, it's a fundamental part of what you need to do for large-scale batteries, because everything in trying to optimize that revenue, and really whether you're using that battery to support other services, other assets that you have, or just as a source of revenue for yourselves. You need to get pretty sophisticated about that these algorithms in this piece of software. So what we will be doing at Pivot Power, for example, we'll have one or two partners that we'll work with, I suspect, who will be offering these sort of services. They'll be looking at those kind of revenues we can get from the grid, and certainly the arbitrage type of market trading that we will be doing. That's where the revenue comes from. So I think without that, you don't really have a system. The batteries themselves have quite sophisticated energy management systems, and even so, we'll be building one of those to be able to sort of umbrella across the different batteries that we have in ours, for example. But what you still need is something that tells those systems when to charge, when to discharge, dispatch, and on what particular market, and placing trades, etc. So that is quite a... I mean, there are aggregators around, of course, and there have been for a while, but I think the sort of thing we're seeing is not... it's quite intensive, and certainly it's being developed for the sort of thing that we're doing. I don't think there are many of those sort of players around. So it's fundamental. I don't know how that's going to really... I don't think that's a domestic play at the moment. Certainly in terms of large-scale assets and how you utilize something of this scale for a council or for a larger network, yes. But it will be interesting to hear Steve's point of view on that when he gets here.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I used to work in data science, and that third party, that red bar in the middle, is absolutely fascinating. There's so many opportunities there in terms of advanced technologies and data science, machine learning, artificial intelligence, if you like. So there's a really big opportunity there for the tech sector to come in, which might be an interesting third party that comes in. Barney, do you have any thoughts on the whole third party issue?
Does that work? Does that work? Yeah, okay. I'll try and cover domestic. It's not actually. I'm not a great expert on it. Thanks, Jim. But I think there's a few things that are happening in the domestic sector. I think I've said for a while, actually, I think this decade is going to be the most interesting for decarbonisation for the customer, because up to now it hasn't really affected us at all. You still got a gas boiler, you still got a petrol car, you still got a light switch. But what will happen in the 2020s is you'll probably end up with an electric car, and more you'll end up with a heat pump, and more you'll end up with variable tariffs for your electricity. And I think those three things will transform the business case for energy storage domestically, because at the moment we all pay a flat tariff. So if you pay a flat tariff and you haven't got a solar roof, there's no point having a battery because you can't benefit from it at all. So those three things will definitely, three or four things will definitely change in the next decade, and it'll be really interesting seeing the consumer reaction to that. I think when they do happen, I think like Tim and Madeline have said, to make the most of them you need a brain or artificial intelligence. At the moment, it's normally people doing things like putting their timers on at different times and stuff. It's going to be a lot more sophisticated. So I think it'll always have a third-party brain, even if you own the battery and it sits in under your stairs or whatever. So I think you'll need that third-party brain. Some other quick thoughts. I think it's going to get more complicated. I think as we're working on a lot of new developments now where, for example, we're providing vehicles as a hire pool. So you just have access to these cars, and then you can have a battery there that's not controlled by you but is controlled by the owner and operator of that whole block of flats and so on. So it's a sort of hybrid affair, and there's a lot of work going on in that as well. I hope that helps.
I guess just another point on that, I suppose the heat example that I talked about is probably a little bit more at the domestic level as well. Certainly, there are smart controls at those levels that already exist. I mean, perhaps we're going a little step further, trying to connect those to time of use and automate all that, but that's already available through certain providers. But certainly with heat pumps, as you say, I mean, I think when you start to bring these things together, those things will become probably quite commonplace.
I think it's really interesting to see, particularly at the domestic level, how that will involve the consumer a lot more than it has up until now. You will have that ability to control your energy system if you want to, the combination of the solar on your roof, your storage, your heat pump, which is really exciting if you like that kind of thing. If not, then that's where the third parties will come in. But there's huge opportunities there, I think.
Hopefully it'll save you money as well.
Yeah, I always forget that bit. I get too excited by all the technology and I'm like, oh yes, and it will save you money, which is the best bit. Let's go out to a couple of questions from the audience, shall we?
Hi, I don't understand why all of the high demand applications, particularly in the domestic environment, are just so thick, right? Why isn't there a market for car chargers that just automatically drop out when there's a frequency event on the grid? Why doesn't your immersion heater do the same thing? Like, I don't notice if my car doesn't charge for 15 seconds, but the grid does. So why isn't there a market? Why isn't there, when you buy a vehicle charger, why is it so dumb? Why can't it see that financial opportunity?
Well, let's take the question from the lady behind, but smart charging is definitely an interesting issue.
Isn't lithium one of those materials? Sorry, isn't lithium one of those materials that has real social problems? And I don't know if anyone can explain a bit more about it. There were other forms of storage, pumped hydro and something else. The freewheel?
Flywheel.
Flywheel.
Yeah.
Flywheel and pumped hydro. I'm kind of more interested in that.
Yeah, okay. Let's take those two questions for now and then we'll come back to some more. Smart charging, I guess, really important for the Oxford project.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's coming. I mean, it's got to. That's one of the things we're working on in that project is the ability. I mean, you'd be surprised that cars and chargers don't know what the state of charge is. Typically, when a car comes into a charger, it typically doesn't know quite. It doesn't know what the vehicle is, and it doesn't. At the moment, it's not easy to determine, how long it's going to need. I mean, with a Tesla, I think they're pretty well advanced, but many others they're not. So the chargers themselves are quite dumb, and what I think you will see is definitely a growth in data to understand what the state of charge is that a vehicle's coming in at, what it needs to get to for the journey that it's trying to achieve, and therefore how long it needs to be there at a certain type of charger. So I think it feels like it's early days, but it's coming. So I think watch this space would be my view. I hope we can demonstrate some bits and pieces of that certainly in the project that we're doing, and certainly trying to schedule when you've got a fleet of vehicles. trying to schedule when you charge which vehicles, the ones that need much, the tipper trucks or the refuse vehicles are going to, huge things are going to need a lot more charging than others, and trying to optimize the profile at which you charge a suite of, 50 or 100 vehicles is definitely something that's going to deliver great benefits. So that's going to be an area where there's I think, quite substantial investment coming.
Barney, any thoughts on smart charging?
Yeah, so I think you're right. It'll happen. I think that you're back to that problem that if you did have that benefit, how would you benefit? And that's this is where you end up with aggregators, I think, because you wouldn't. How would you get paid for that service? Is the challenge at the moment, I think. So, but yeah, I agree. It'll definitely happen. And I think it's not just cars. It's freezers, it's washing machines, it's chillers, it's you name it. So yeah.
I'm not sure if Octopus Energy are here today. They probably are because they're everywhere. But I would recommend, if that's of interest to you, check out their stand or just go on their website, because they are really into that issue of how do we make things smarter, how do we make things more adaptable to the grid. So there's definitely work on it at the moment. Let's move on to the question of lithium, because I think that's a really interesting point, a really important one. I have quite a lot of thoughts on it, but I'll ask you guys first. Do you want me to?
Well, I'll just give you my thoughts. I think the whole second-hand market for these batteries is going to develop. I think you will see. So for a first point, I think we'll be able to reuse those batteries in secondary and tertiary situations for things that don't quite need the same full level of charge, for example. So hopefully we'll get benefits out of that. So you're making more use of the lithium. I think the lithium itself, I don't think that's the main problem. I think that it's very, very plentiful, and I think available in several parts of the world. What you do have is some of the other components of the current lithium batteries, things like cobalt, which are a much bigger problem, come from pretty much one place, and there you have all sorts of questions around the sort of environment in which that's built. So I think what I'm interested in, and I don't think it's there yet, but there's quite a lot of papers coming out on how the opportunities for recycling all of those key components within lithium batteries. I'm sure that will develop, and hopefully there'll be reuse of the batteries as well as recycling of those key components, so that we really make the best of it. And I think also, different state types of lithium battery are coming onto the market, and I think you'll see technology develop where maybe we don't need some of these elements that are more problematic, and other things come up that provide us with benefits as well. But I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Any thoughts, Barney, before I go off on
Sorry, no, I'd largely agree with what Tim said. Yeah, it's a good point.
As the electricity storage network is something that we're really concerned about, because it is an issue. Lithium and cobalt, as well, as Tim said, and nickel, I think, is another one that's problematic. Anywhere where you've got to extract minerals, we're talking about the same issues that we've had with fossil fuels over the last few decades. It always comes with problems. It's in areas of the world where there's maybe less control, less transparency, and opportunities for human rights abuses and environmental abuses as well. And I would just say, I'll go to what we are doing on that in a minute, but I would just say I don't want to be building up an industry that is meant to be helping with decarbonisation, helping with the climate emergency that we have, addressing issues that we've already made to the planet, by just creating another problem with poor extraction, environmental and through human rights abuses as well. So we're thinking about it very carefully. I think your point about different technologies is a really important one. It's not just going to be about lithium ion. So we're not going to be stopping extracting lithium and cobalt, but we can certainly reduce it by, mitigate that by having those other technologies. I'd be interested if the panel have got a view on another technology that I think is useful and interesting, but there are several, as I put on that slide. So we can mitigate that a bit by having that range of technologies. There's a recycling, so we can make sure that we're reusing what we're doing. I think there's a bit of an issue at the moment. People talk about lithium-ion batteries just going on a waste dump, and that has a lot of environmental issues and health and safety issues itself, but also just not very helpful. We need to be reusing that. So there is some really interesting stuff going on about how we recycle and reuse. China are doing really well at that at the moment, so always worth having a look into that. But also, we just need to get better at our supply chain. We need to be more transparent with where it's coming from. We need to think about it more carefully, and people are, I think, it's coming. We're still quite nascent in the industry, I suppose, in terms we've only, like I was saying, that growth we've seen in 5 years, really. So we're still quite in the early stages of how we make sure this industry is structured. But people are definitely concerned about it and thinking about, okay, if I'm sourcing a battery, if I'm investing in a battery, where are those minerals coming from? How can I ensure that that supply chain is ethical and sustainable? So I could go on about that for ages, so please do come and talk to me at the end. But fascinating issue. Thanks for bringing it up. Flywheels. Yeah. Oh, well, actually, yeah. If anyone, if you've got any opinions on flywheels in particular, but if not, a particular other technology of storage that you'd like to flag that's interesting, or you're going to see in the near future.
I think there's two that are interesting, in my opinion. So I think the pump storage is amazing, and it is worth visiting De Norwig to see the pumped hydro there. They call it the Electric Mountain. I think its problem is obviously it's very, very constrained. You can't just build pumped storage anywhere. So that's one of its issues. With flywheels, I think they've just been undercut by lithium-ion batteries and the flexibility that batteries bring, because you can buy batteries at essentially any scale and they're very modular. So that's the challenge there. So interesting and underused at the moment is there's just a lot of storage in things like hot water we're not using at the moment. It's just free. That was my point in the presentation. It's just there already, and we can use that much more intelligently. And then right at the other end of the scale, I think stored hydrogen for peaking power when we are going to need power for days, if not weeks, when there's imbalances in the system, will be an amazing thing in the next 20 years. So that's my bet.
Tim, any particular thoughts? You want to talk about vanadium flow again?
No, I think I've done vanadium flow for you guys. No others, I don't think so. I mean, but molten storage systems as well. That's another one that I think is interesting. I don't know a lot about them, but I know installers who are now working with heat pumps to looking at molten storage at a domestic level as well, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I'm developing, and I don't have a favourite.
I don't know an awful lot about flywheels, but I do know that they come with certain, quite a lot of losses, I think. So in terms of that round trip efficiency, gosh, I can't believe I just said that. So it's very much a storage buzzword. You lose something when you put 10 megawatts in, you might get 8 megawatts out or something like that. It's not as efficient as other technologies. So that's the main thing that I know about flywheels. I'm sure there was someone here who has lots of good mechanical info about how flywheels work. Let's take some other questions. Oh, just check, is Steve here? Steve made it? No? Okay, let's take some questions from the audience then.
My name's Gilles Moret. I have an interest in renewables. There has been no mention on this panel about storing heat using sodium hydroxide, and no mention of gravity trains as a form of energy storage. Is there any reason why it was left off from your presentation? What was the first one?
I don't want to dwell too much on technology again, because I think we did a little bit of that. Gravity storage, definitely very interesting. My caveat is that we do electricity in, electricity out, so we don't look in too much detail about converting it into heat and things like that. But panel, got any further thoughts on it?
What was the first technology?
Converting electricity into heat using sodium. Is that right?
It's storing heat using sodium hydroxide, and then restoring the heat to produce electricity.
Not really an expert. I mean, that's the sort of technology they're using in some of the big CSP solar plants, I think, isn't it? Molten sodium storage. But I mean, it's not something that I would think is. I don't know whether that doesn't sound like a very viable thing for smaller scale. Certainly when you're talking about domestic at the moment. Larger scale, possibly, but not an expert, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Yeah, so on the sodium, I don't know if you mean the salt where you drive off the water and then when you re-add the water. Okay, so I mean that does have potential for long-term seasonal energy storage. I think I haven't seen any of it in the market, so I suppose that's the reason. And I imagine Tim and I tend to work at more the commercial end rather than the research and development end. I think on gravity trains, I think they're a bit like pumped hydro. You need a hill and you need a railway line, and so there's only, so I can't, most of us can't benefit from that technology. I suppose that would be my thought.
I would check out Gravitricity if you're interested in gravity storage, because they're probably the closest that I've seen to actually making gravity storage a reality, using mine shafts and things like that. I don't know if they're here today maybe or not, but they're a fascinating company. Let's take some more questions. The lady at the front here in green.
Thanks. A few miles up the road from here, a new hospital is likely to be being built, and it'll be a massive building development because also they're looking at developing like 1,800 homes. And I'm involved in local health campaigns and environmental campaigns, and we are trying very hard to get the powers that be that are going to lead this development to make it state of the art, carbon zero, or zero, lowest carbon as possible, and the best possible environment. The current stage that they're at is probably this year they'll be doing the outline business case. And I've got two questions. One is, how can we inspire them to do a lot more than just BREEAM Excellence, which they've already committed to? And could there be something like a hospital's demo project like the Oxford one developed? What would be the route, who to contact? And secondly, at what stage in the development would it be necessary to, for example, decide what method of storage you're going to use if they're going to use load of solar panels, for example? So is it the master planning stage? What stage is it?
That's a really interesting question. I think it really ties into the project that Tim was talking about, of course. But I just think a wider point about storage is going to be, in the future, about integration with other technologies. We've seen a lot of batteries in fields on their own, providing services to the grid, which is useful in itself, but that integration with that whole system that you're talking about, I think, is going to be so more important in future. Any thoughts on that? Quite a wide range of questions there, but any particular things, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we're not doing that particular type of facility in Oxford, but the heat pumps could definitely be a candidate for that. But in my local council, which is Kingston, down in southwest London, we've got similar sort of very large scale developments. I'm sure there's a lot going on everywhere, which are going through that same sort of process, housing developments. Of how does the council work with the developer, and what sort of arrangement do they set up to ensure that you're not just being led by the developer at, what the lowest cost, whatever's best for them, etc. And I know the council that we are has set up a true joint venture between a development company and themselves, so that they can keep a control on that. So it's a very large social housing type of arrangement through the whole process. So we're kind of pre-master planning on that at the moment, and I know they've set up that arrangement, but the heating side of that, I think they haven't decided exactly what the solution will be. They're still trying to get the residents to vote on whether they want to do it or not. But CHP, probably something of that size for a hospital, and a central combined heat and power type network is probably going to be the most cost effective. Storage's role in that, I don't know, Steve. I'm sorry, Barney. I don't know whether you have thoughts on how you'd, if there's the generation as well, if there's solar panels or other forms of microgeneration, then yes, you will need that to be part of the equation. But it is interesting. It's one that I'm quite interested in, is how you, and again locally for where I am, how you ensure that journey is made very much with a roadmap in mind. And one of the things I think we're missing, in my experience of talking to my local councillors, and this is why I think things like the Oxford project might be helpful, is trying to set out some sort of framework for councils as to how they develop their whole region with individual developments like this in a sort of structured way, taking account of where they want to be in the future on electric vehicle networks, where they want to be on the way they electrify their bus network, and heating systems and around the council. I don't think there are many councils really who know how to go about that at the moment. And I think the government and Innovate UK, the companies we're working with on the project, are all trying to understand whether this is the right way of doing it. Do we set out a kind of typical framework of which you can sort of select items that might work for you and your council, or is it more efficient to let them get on with bits and pieces in different areas? So I'm really interested to see how that plays out. I'm hoping that this project that we're involved with could sort of help us towards that sort of suggested framework that local authorities could pick up on. But I don't think there's an answer to that at the moment, and I think hopefully they'll do it in a sensible way and make the right sort of organisational relationships that mean that it's done in a way that is addressing what they hope the long-term strategy is going to be, but it's combined and it's not just the developer. So, sorry if I don't know if that helps, but that's my views on it.
Thanks. Barney, have you got any thoughts on that?
We do work on a lot of new developments, and some quick thoughts. I mean, I don't know who owns it, who the developer is, and so on. So there's a lot of questions. I mean, personally, I wouldn't get hung up on energy storage if I was working on a new development. I think more important things would be making sure the energy bills are very, very low. Is it in London? Is it in the GLA area? Okay, so it'll almost certainly be all electric, which will have benefits around air quality and so on. I'd be thinking about that sort of a healthy place to live. So an energy storage will have a part to play within that, I'm sure, but it wouldn't be top on my list of priorities. In terms of affecting them, I think get together in large numbers, and the earlier the better. I suppose if the NHS are involved themselves, because often what the NHS are doing, they're selling a big hospital, making it small and putting some houses here. They'll have quite a lot of influence, obviously, so they can set the standard for the sale, so that might be a leverage point.
I think maybe a broader point on that is that who actually holds responsibility for making sure that new development is low carbon? I think that's where we're seeing a lot of issues, is because no one really thinks it's their responsibility. They have a lot of rhetoric around this is really important and we want things to be low carbon, but actually it's the responsibility of the distribution network to make sure that everything's low carbon. It's the responsibility of the construction people, the developer. The book gets passed around quite a lot, I find. So if your council has declared a climate emergency, that should be their responsibility, and some are really good at that, some aren't. In Devon, for example, we've got a net zero task force, which has come out of the declaring a climate emergency, and they're now saying, well, actually, how do we do that? And they're taking ownership of it and responsibility. And I think that's where we're seeing things actually changing, being really important, and not being able, Devon County Council aren't able to just say, well, we're not getting enough from government, so we can't do it. They're actually owning the problem, and I think that's where it'd be really important. Every single person in that development, every single organisation should have a responsibility to make sure that they're meeting net zero targets. That's a broader point, really. Do we have time for one more question, do you think, or should we call it there? We'll call it there. Right, thanks very much for listening, everyone. Thanks to Tim and Barney for that.